Yes, you
Ye-
wrote.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start. So as today's talk is about understanding digital worlds, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my doctoral research, which was really um, about understanding sort of the role that Facebook plays in the lives of lower middle class men in urban India. And I'm going to be specifically talking about Pune, which is where I did my research. So I'll start out with an ethnographic snippet. While driving around Pune in the summer heat with Rakesh, who was a young man studying at a local government college, I noticed that for many young men like him, socializing with friends was more than just a daily occurrence, but it was a way of life. Instead of attending classes, they were more likely to be found spending their days passing the time, chatting with friends, sharing cups of tea, cracking jokes, and engaging in mock fights, in which they would playfully lock a friend's head in the crook of their arms or their shoulders. And during these activities, what I noticed was that there was something that was ever present, and that was social media and their phones. I noticed that these young men would be seamlessly sort of switching between talking and conversing with one another and scrolling on their social media and Facebook feeds on their phones. And there was one social networking site that captured their attention like no other, Facebook. And I'd say that because my fieldwork happened in 2016, 2017, when Facebook was really at its peak. What I noticed when I saw these young men's Facebook profiles was that unlike how they appeared in real life, on Facebook they were almost unrecognizable in the selfies they posted. Here on these selfies they stood alone, bearing sorry, a serious expression. They wore dark glasses and gold chains and leaned against a wall. Confronting the camera, they either crossed their arms or tousled their beards. And I asked Rakesh, why do young men choose to look like this on Facebook? And he told me this: it's to strike fear in the hearts of other men. We edit these photos like this because we want to look bold. We want to show our uniqueness through these photos. So while India has been sort of heralded for the globalization of its economy, many young men in India's cities actually remain invisible and excluded from India's sort of IT-led growth. And for many young men in Pune, the gleaming apartment complexes, the new coffee shops, the IT parks that sort of mark Pune's aspirational landscape are actually just beyond the reach of these men. But when it comes to Facebook, what I found was that actually anything was possible. Here, they could mold themselves in the image of, the muscular Bollywood hero. Um, and what I found was that the digital transformations that they brought to themselves on Facebook rarely stayed online. It was always designed to sort of leak back into their real life and sort of raise their status and their confidence amongst their local communities. In an age where, the loss of privacy and the manipulation of data by social media companies is something that many people sort of worry about and is seen as a threat. On the other hand, young men in Pune that I worked with took full advantage of the publicity of Facebook. The Facebook that they created was very different from the first Facebook that first started out in the early 2000s, where it was a place for people to express their thoughts, stay connected to friends, share updates in their lives. When it came to the men that I worked with, Facebook was completely different. It was all about creating an arena of masculine competition where alliances were built, performances were very carefully rehearsed, and their reputations were really on the line. I ended up sort of undertaking fieldwork in colleges and neighborhoods and Facebook accounts of young men in Pune, focusing on the work that they undertake on Facebook to craft themselves. So the public nature of Facebook, where it contains collapsed audiences of many different people that otherwise in real life are often kept separate. There's close friends, there's college peers, there's neighborhood friends, there's cousins. On Facebook, everybody becomes collapsed together. So it becomes a very different space to the sorts of close circle of friends that young men would hang out with offline. The way that Facebook was seen as public therefore shaped how they approached the platform. And it meant that they would use particular technologies on Facebook in very specific ways to achieve things that often they found were restricted in their real life. So, I'll just give one example. Here, they would use the feature of the tag button on Facebook, which was sort of designed as a way to identify other people in an image. In the case, when the respondents that I worked with, it was used for a completely different purpose. What they did was that when they would post a picture of themselves, they would use the tag button to tag numerous people in that photo, sometimes up to 80, 100 people at a time, even though they were the only people visible in the photo. And the reason for doing this is because it's about ensuring both the instancy but also the scale of their visibility. And this was in contrast to the sort of invisibility that many young men experienced off screen. These were men who felt sort of excluded and left behind from the way that Pune was developing as a city, with multiplex cinemas and coffee shops and nightlife venues. These were spaces that many young men felt, sort of left out from, for various different reasons. Culturally, it felt alien to them, but it also felt, uh, you know, beyond their reach financially. Um, and so as a result, Facebook ended up becoming the place where they focused a lot of their effort into devising a kind of visibility. And by that, I don't mean to say that they were uh, only using that Facebook was the only place where any sort of claim to visibility happened. It was happening offline in certain ways. So I'll just give an example. It was in the efforts of these young men to sort of rev up the engines of their motorbikes as they drove around the city, creating loud sounds as they drove around. And as one of my respondents did that, he said, "Do you hear that? That's the sound of attraction. Everybody watches us. Even though making this sound is now banned in Pune, we don't care. We don't follow the rules." So there were sort of ways in which they sort of did try to achieve some sort of respect and visibility in their day-to-day life. But with Facebook, everything sort of became more amplified and more possible. Other crafts, other forms of labor that they undertook on Facebook included creating visual aesthetic that was designed to sort of mask the reality of their off-screen life, their surroundings, and where they lived. That was all sort of hidden on Facebook. The influence of masculinity and mass popular culture in India, from political signboards to film song sequences to the increasing muscularity of how Hindu gods are now represented, that was all seen in the kinds of ways that young men would create their selfies on Facebook. And so what it meant was that using Facebook's publicity to their advantage, they actually produced a very different kind of image to what to what the world knows as the selfie. The selfie is globally been known as an image that is spontaneous, taken on the smartphone by oneself. It's meant to be an intimate sort of peek into someone's life. But the selfie in Pune that I noticed on many young men's Facebook pages was often not taken by themselves. They would hire a photographer using a DSLR camera, and it would not be intimate at all and or spontaneous. In fact, it was very highly choreographed. They would be posing, wearing very specific kinds of clothes, never smiling, and that was because for them, Facebook became a place to perform sort of public facing versions of themselves for the wider audience. It was not about creating relatability or connections of friendship. It was about inspiring awe and, making people respect them and feel impressed by them. So there was a sort of distancing that was actually going on in sort of how they presented themselves on Facebook. It's not like it was very different from how the traditional selfie is all about creating closeness and creating intimacy because you're quite close to the camera. But with the selfies that young men were posting, it was about standing far away from the camera. And sort of in doing that, they're also sort of creating a distance between themselves and their viewers. It was about creating this impression that I'm someone who you can't get too close to because you have to take me seriously. And as when I spoke to young men about why they created these kinds of images, they would tell me things like it's about looking bold, or it's about being different, or it's about standing out. And so, sort of in contrast to their real or off screen lives, where they often sort of lacked the ability to stand out in any kind of way, Facebook became the canvas through which they could manipulate how they appeared and sort of craft their masculinity and present themselves as men worthy of respect. Sorry, how much time do I have left?
I think another 5 minutes. You can just
Okay,
wrap.
sure, sure. So, and I just sort of want to pose this in slight contrast to how they um, interacted with each other off screen, because that uh, sort of shaped the way that they created very distinct boundaries between what socializing with friends offline meant versus on Facebook. And the ways that they interacted on offline in their colleges and their neighborhoods was completely different. It was not at all about distance. There was, intense physical contact and touch. They would always, be hanging around with each other with one person's arm slung around another person's shoulder. They would often be joking with each other and laughing and teasing and making fun of each other all the time. That was how sort of intimacy and friendship sort of played out off screen. But with Facebook, all those things were hidden and were never shown. There was rarely ever did they sort of crack jokes on Facebook. Never did they ever make fun of anybody on Facebook in the way that they often did with their friends offline. Um, and that sort of meant that Facebook then ended up occupying a very different space in their life. It sort of filled in many ways a kind of void for the sorts of political kind of gesturing and status raising that they attempted in some ways offline, but didn't really have the tools to do so. As I said earlier, revving up their motorbikes was one of the ways in which they would try and create some sort of respect for themselves. But they were really sort of limited in their means to do so. Um, but Facebook really became the place, whether it was, as I said, through the tag button. I'll just very briefly give another example, which I thought was very interesting, which was the Facebook birthday post. And so the Facebook has designed the birthday post in such a way that when it's someone's birthday, you can directly wish them, and your post will appear on that person's wall. But when I worked with young men, they would never post um, Facebook birthday wishes in that way. They would never post it directly on somebody's wall. They would always wish someone else on their own wall. So if it was, say, your birthday, I would wish you happy birthday, but on my page, writing a long birthday message to you and tagging you. And the reason why they did this is because they knew that uh, if I wished you on my page, everybody in my audience would see the post and learn about you. And so actually what it then meant was that it was not about showing care or actually friendship. It was about an exchange of audiences. It was about granting publicity to somebody else in the hope that they would grant me publicity back. Or if in the future I needed help, I could rely on you because I've given you my audience. I've given you the kind of publicity that everyone was seeking. And so what that sort of then meant was that every technology that they were using on Facebook, they were recrafting and retooling in such a way so to as sort of increase the scale at which they could be visible. Um, you know, in their colleges, I would see sometimes young men sort of walk into college with a certain kind of swag, and they would dress in certain kinds of clothes, clearly, attempting to sort of obtain some sort of visibility. But Facebook sort of took that to an even higher degree, and because of the technological possibilities, it meant that the possibilities for publicity were endless. So, sort of to kind of just close my discussion, what I just want to say is that there is a very different kind of labor happening on Facebook that's very different to the kind of labor that we think about when we talk about technology in India. You know, this is not the kind of labor of call center workers who are putting in long hours to achieve socioeconomic mobility in the way that technology has facilitated in India. And what I observed is that there is labor that is happening, but it's happening digitally, and it's not about achieving actual socioeconomic mobility, but it's about sort of it's about achieving a rise in status, and it's about navigating their class positions without actually being able to move out of those class positions and move up. Um, it was about sort of being able to overcome the obstacles that they experience due to their socioeconomic positions. It was not about materially changing their circumstances, but it was about helping them create more confident versions of themselves. And so what I have been talking about is kind of the way that many men in India are sort of exploring the internet outside of the IT economy. Here, they're not participating as employees; they're participating as consumers of Facebook via their phones. And as I I guess the main point that I want to sort of highlight is that what the way that these young men use Facebook reveals the kind of the malleability of social media, because they would often subvert many of Facebook's technologies, like the selfie, like the birthday post, like the tag button, to their own needs. And they sort of were constructing a digital world that was really just all designed about um, about masculinity and about performance and about confidence and about status. It was not about intimacy. It was not about friendship. It was really about how social media has enabled them to sort of navigate the uncertainty of economic change. Um, so yeah, so just to conclude, there is a particular kind of selfhood and a particular kind of digital world that is being constructed, that's very different to sort of how much of social media is used in other parts of the world. Here, young men in Pune were not using Facebook to express themselves. They were not using it to reach global networks. They were not even using it to really escape their real life. But it was all about using Facebook to sort of stage their masculinity and enhance their status in such a way that then when it came back to their off-screen lives, they felt more confident and they felt more visible and respected. Um, so yeah, that's the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Rahul. I really found it fascinating. And maybe during the question and answer round, I will pose that as a question about the corporate selfie that you talk about, but also to think about the form of Facebook and the idea of a timeline as being a discourse that are of myself that I control. And so wishing somebody on somebody else's timeline would mean servicing their discourse as opposed to servicing my own. And when I do that on my own timeline, and I would want to just leave you with that and maybe come back to it when we are discussing at the end of everyone's presentation. But thank you so much. With that, I would like to invite Chitra. Chitra, are you able to hear me? Chitra, are you able to hear me? I think Chitra is having some trouble with her audio. Chitra, can you log out and log in again? That's all right. So let's give Chitra a moment, and then let me proceed to Tripta. Tripta, are you able to hear me?
Hi,
Yes. Hi. Hi,
hi,
Tripta.
hi, hi, hi. Uh, Hi, thanks. And I'll jump in right away because thanks, Rukun, for that presentation. Because even if you won't like to register it as such, I'm already recognizing you as a collaborator to my work, because your work, your presentation really sets the premise for the presentation I'm making. And I've shared the larger text with the panelists, and I'll be putting it on my blog. And just before I start, I'd really like to thank Sriti for remembering me after I don't know how many years and thinking of my work. And I'm really grateful to be over here at this moment, particularly because I'd recently announced my my larger project. So without wasting any more time, I'll get on to it. Kilfies, Killing in the Name of the Self, is the presentation I'm making as an urgent provocation towards revolutionary future, digital and otherwise. It's part of my ongoing larger work, listening as philosophy in action, within which I'm undertaking an autoethnography of the Savarna life works.
Ripta, would
But to
you
briefly,
share the presentation with the audience?
I have shared. It's not a.
Yes, I can share.
Uh, I've
Just 1 second.
no, it's not a presentation. Sorry, it's I'm reading a text. If anyone is interested, but the presentation I'm reading out. Sorry, I don't have a presentation. Sorry. My bad. I wasn't. Yeah. So just to continue to briefly outline the mandate of my project, the larger project, listening as philosophy in action. Wherein I'm undertaking an autoethnography of the Savarna life worlds, and that is where the madness also comes in. And in this project, by inserting and making available in evidentiary capacities my own hegemonic Savarna fully elite form, also an ontological location, I aim to expose the intellectual disingenuity, philosophical corruption, and reactionary politics central to the subaltern and post-colonial studies in reducing the specifically working class body, embodying philosophically recognized revolutionary proletariat spirits to incoherent, idiotic subaltern qualifications. This cunning of reason, I insist, reveals perverse commitments to caste logic to ensure that the Savarna locations remain unchallenged, such that the likes of us, we never have to share all the obscene freedoms we have with anyone else. By locating everyone, including ourselves, who ask for freedoms as a bumbling idiot, aka subaltern. The horror is not that the subaltern studies recognizes the working class, who's really the only eternal other who matters. The perversity is that in their insatiable lust for power, for their centers to always be the same, they went as far as to even self-identify as bumbling idiots, therefore philosophically silencing the shrieks of the eternal other, assuming the role of their spokesperson, considering the tongues were the same to same. I submit the ongoing general elections as a material evidence of the philosophical violence unleashed by the savage subaltern studies Savarna gang. So I begin with my Kilfi provocations. I have in the larger text, I have, this should be in the page 12, but I've set the premise for like how qualified that we are living in a perverted capitalist society. And it is within the backdrop of the perverted capitalist society that I want to propose a schematic located within the class matrix, emboldened and inspired by Jody Dean's formulation of selfie communism, to identify selfie as a hegemonic manifestation of its dictionary meaning, that is, quote, an image that includes oneself often with another person or as a part of a group, and is taken by oneself using a digital camera, especially for posting on social networks, close. With Kilfies as its perverted manifestation emerging and immanent with the perversions of poverty. Here, sharing my enthusiasm about the inherent powers of selfies with Dean, I propose to read Kilfies in all their perversions born out of the perversity of poverty as they are, as the material evidence to testify the crimes capitalism commits, so that, again in alignment with Dean, we can stretch its selfie's power to its logical extreme to recognize that a quote selfies are a communist form of expression, social products appropriated by capitalism, quote close. Kilfies is not a theatrical invention. It is a warning issued by the Indian state to warn its subject to be careful about the circumstances in which they take selfies, in case they become kilfies. In dangerous circumstances, the state insists selfies can kill, and insists it's best to avoid these circumstances. Here, I evoke kilfies as an epistemological marker to locate the working class life force. In the schematic I am proposing, selfies to be recognized in their most nominal philosophical, poetic, and political sense as the objectified other of the self, with the complete willing and knowing of the latter, the self, to become someone else, anyone else other than the self. Selfies are an acrobatic indulgence, poetically, philosophically, politically. The act demands inverting the technological object to make the self the subject of the production, to obscenely objectify, to be received as an object of desire in that othered iteration. I'm taking liberties here. I'm not a philosopher, not yet. The power of selfies as material objects, which circulate and reproduce a logic of capitalism within its communicative currency, is nothing compared to the profound exploration of true self-consciousness in its very Hegelian sense. The act of producing the selfie makes available to everyone, irrespective of which body is holding the camera. The camera, either in a fully elite form like mine, or specifically the working class, not subaltern body, which imprisons SRK's destiny. To briefly introduce SRK, who features in my work, he's also Shahrukh. He's a Juggiwala. He was born a Juggiwala, will most likely die as one, but not in the one he lives in. The slums he calls his world are currently being cleared. Even if his address shifts, it is unlikely that he will escape his Juggiwala destinations and or the indignities which are this location's destinies. SRK knows this too well. I was visiting the Juggis. On this day, I found SRK yet again being beaten up by the client who called him 25 kilometers away to fuck him mercilessly as agreed, but left him curled in pain on the roadside, of course without paying, but also leaving with his 15,000 wala bilkul naya hi phone. On a borrowed phone, SRK showed me a tide image of his as his glimpse of hope, his strategic plan to yet again procure a phone with a camera, which will have to be thoda sa expensive for its filters and other features, but he's getting a lot of client requests. The tide selfie, which I've spoken about in the larger test, but not yet. It was an image of him being tied, obviously in a hotel room, being tied, and where there were bruise marks on his body. And this was with a client, and this is the image the client had tagged. That request was detailed. This man with his friends wanted to throw a rape fantasy party for a man who really goes both ways and also is also a local bully too. हमारे यहाँ का hero है, who's getting married for sorry. Sorry, just give me a moment.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. The report was detailed. This man with his friends wanted to throw a rape fantasy party for a man who really goes both ways and getting married for very obvious reasons. But to prepare him for his shadi wali life, they want to present him a rape party to enact his deepest fantasy. But mine, with his extreme poverty den. SRK, who's known for his junky ways, was promised injection wala fun if he could pretend to be dead, or they could make sure he passes out, so they could actualize their rapist friend's necrophiliac desires too. SRK did not have to be told using innovative communicative strategies and behavioral change interventions about how philosophically painful and humiliating the ask of playing dead was. The fact that the ask made him howl only reiterate how deeply the working class subaltern feels the pain and is only and always shrieking. Here I present SRK's died selfie, which provoked necrophiliac desires as a material evidence to insist on kilfies as an epistemological marker of the only forms and formations available to the working class proletariat to present themselves. Again, agreeing with Dean, I do not dismiss the culture of narcissism which selfies is associated with. Instead, within the schematic I'm proposing, selfies and its obscenely self-indulgent, narcissistic, exploring the catharsis of the self is the permissions, platforms, and praxis available to the hegemonic, fully formed elite upper caste and upper class bodies and on locations like mine. While each iteration of other thing a working class body enacts in its desire for selfing always is a kilfee. They cannot follow the Indian state's advice to avoid the circumstances in which they take selfies in case they become kilfies. And then I speak about how the perversions of poverty they are not only prevailing, but the poor also realize that. Through the epistemological marker of kilfee, I want to present SRK's died selfie as a starting point towards deliberating strategies to ensure that such fates in every and each real, metaphorical, or fantastical evocations do not await the working class, which in fact is a desired end of the hegemonic whole's never satiating wide appetites. To arrive at the assured collective promise inherent to the act of selfing, of the shared exhilaration that my identity or sense of self, this is from Jody, that my identity or sense of self is not so singular or unique that it can only stand for itself. It's interchangeable with others. We need to make a revolutionary gesture. Nothing else will do. First and foremost, the working class needs to be liberated from his subaltern sentencing and its non-speaking qualifications. By admitting in evidence the kilfies he circulates as material evidence of his knowing, always knowing not only directions to himself, to his own self, but the many others of his self in his loud, clear, and shrieking ways. In fact, instead we should make the revolutionary gesture we should make is to recognize what the working class already knows about his universal proletariat locations and celebrate his philosophically, politically, and historically substantiated revolutionary spirits and call him a comrade already. To end, lest there are any hesitations or more evidence is required, let me draw on my 25 years, quarter of a century in clock time experience, working in close collaboration with the working class, to let you know that each, every, and any time you do in fact call a working class by his preferred noun, comrade, rest assured, you shall be welcomed with greetings common in these circuits. Roaring Lal Salam, we shall overcome someday. Hum honge kamyab, walk hand in hand. He does know a thing or two about revolution. After all, isn't his whole life an unactualized desire to be someone else, anyone else, other than what he is? Which, if you really think about, is revolution in short. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tripta. This was very strong, and I'm still gathering my thoughts. So I'm going to come back to you with a question myself. I really like the prompt that you've left, which is to be someone else, anyone else, is one of the things to think about. Thank you so much. With that, may I ask Chitra? Chitra, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, Chitra.
Now, am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Smriti. So, hello, everybody. What I'll be doing is I'll just explain in brief what my doctoral dissertation work is about, and I'll try and bring in insights of some of the topics that are covered therein. So my research work was about specifically to study memes and edits as forms of internet humor, and it's a study that is grounded in the field of digital sociology, internet studies, and humor studies as well. So in that context, I would describe it deeply as it's the study of internet humor to understand the internet. One of the questions that I've grappled with is whether internet is the site or is it not site because it hosts other sites. So when we say that we are doing digital ethnography, are we actually doing digital ethnography every time we stake that claim, or are we using methods in digital ethnography is something that is of interest to me. So what I did is I looked at 3 specific sites on the internet in order to understand internet humor. But the larger question that is interesting to me is more towards the topic of how we understand concepts as cyber democracy, democratic deficit in that sort, and the questions that come from some classic social science perspectives. So, cringe humor to me is something that is very closely associated with status anxieties and the responses that come from that. So, what I'll try to do is I'll try to bring in insights and briefly talk about my rough conclusions that have come from there. So, first things first, we have to understand is that within the last decade, when I say decade, I'm being a little liberal about it, but within the last 7 or 8 years, digital platforms have undergone a lot of change, and we often see these characters wherein there's a person who could be roughly referred to as a netizen, a user of the internet. Some of them have today become professional content creators, and what has brought about this change is something that's very interesting to me, because if we look at 2014, 2015, YouTubers were a thing, and even today we have YouTubers, but YouTube is just a platform where content creator posts what they have worked about, whatever they have created. To put it very simply, they are digital creators. So this kind of transition where YouTube and Facebook coexisted, they were more popular, and the inclusion of short video formats. TikTok is now banned, but we in the country, but we still have Instagram. We still have other apps. At one point, we had Vines. These changes are quite interesting to me. So, some of the rough dualities that are very important from the point of view of understanding what is the impact of the internet on any given topic that we are trying to study. To put it very simplistically, I'll pose it this way: are the existing hierarchies in society being reinforced, or is internet a way of exercising one's right to be a cyber citizen? that could be like the spectrum of two possibilities, and where do content creators and people who are simple users of the internet lie is something that is very interesting to me. One of the sites that I studied, perhaps some of you know it, there is a very popular YouTube channel called Carrie Minati, uh, and it was active a few years back. So, what would happen is that this person, content creator, would create videos that were dubbed as roasts. They were basically reaction videos, and they would continuously bring in cringe pop tracks. So cringe pop is a song that is based on the comedy of awkwardness that are deliberately meant to be cringeworthy. So as a sociologist, what was interesting to me is how do we define what is cringeworthy? What is cringe about cringe pop? Is something that I was trying to understand. For me, it was a continuous kind of a back and forth between multiple masculinities. We usually think of a self and the other, or a hegemonic and the others. But in this channel, I found that there were multiple others and multiple selves. The idea of an alpha or a sigma wasn't really dominating, because a content creator would fit the profile of geek, of a young person who would sport his glasses, and the users who would comment on those videos would address the person as Carrie Bhaiya, even though Carrie wasn't his real name. So there was already an alternative masculinity in place from where the internalized gaze was coming in, and that is how the humor worked. That being said, there was still a very strong reference and membership type of a dynamic that was happening between the people who are the subject of that humor, and the person who was creating those jokes, and everyone else who was commenting on it. So in terms of masculinity, I felt like this type of videos do belong to the manosphere, but perhaps it would be entirely accurate to say that they are a good representation of that, although there will be common elements that will keep coming again and again. The ideas of sexing, the ideas of flaunting caste, something that were reoccurring themes that I observed many times. The more interesting part of my observations were on a public Facebook group. Now we have to understand that if we are trying to break down the idea of a manosphere and choosing a particular case that illustrates the same, it's a sphere, it's not a space, or it's right, but there will be multi-sidedness in that sphere. Let me put it that way. So this public Facebook group was very interesting in that sort. It was created for posting memes about a particular topic. So there's a movie called Shivaji, and its Hindi dub is called Shivaji the Boss. This group was entirely dedicated to creating and sharing memes that use templates from this movie alone. But that didn't mean that there wasn't any other theme that was reoccurring over and over again. So I used lurking as a method of researcher, and obviously, like, I used my primary profile, so it was visible that I'm a female researcher. Despite that, I could add myself number of times in that group. I was never removed. My interactions were very minimal, and there were other female members of that public group as well. But this group was, needless to say, the humor was male dominated. Usually it would hypersexualize the female lead character of that movie, and Rajnikant, who was the star of that movie, his still swoopy used as something that represents the sigma male, the Chad, who is being hero worshipped by other men who may not be sigmas or alphas or Chads, but they are looking up to him. So in a way, I would say that this meant that the manosphere will always have permeable boundaries, but that doesn't guarantee exclusivity of any kind. So the idea of a membership here, if we want to go back and understand membership and reference group, is that there is a technical membership towards being a part of a particular site on the internet. That's one part of it. But are you truly a member of the manosphere? Now, that is something that could be perhaps broken down in a thematic way, and it's not about that particular space, as in we can't reduce it to being on a page that has particular hyperlink. So that was like one part of it. The other interesting thing that I found in terms which went outside of the scope of this particular page was that if I want to make a bifurcation about how do I see spaces in the manosphere on the internet where a lot of people are interacting, there would be some sites that are purely virtual. So the entire activity, all of the activity that is contained in these sites happens on the internet, and that's where it ends. It will affect the person who is a participant, but the sites are the activity is contained within those sites. The other type being the sites that are an extension of the offline world. Both will obviously compose, in what you term, the real virtuality. So the second type was more interesting to me because we know that there are many men's rights organizations. There are these MRA type people who have offline events and rallies. So what would happen is there would be a page. For example, there's a page called Men's Rights India. So it would connect you to their own website, which would enlist helplines and whatnot. And then their Facebook page would post just like a meme page does, in order to expand their reach, in order to ensure that there is visibility, there is sufficient visibility. That would be the other type. And both, obviously, both compose the manosphere, is what I found out. Now, like the third part of it is where content creation may be male dominated, but the site is such that we don't know whether it belongs to the manosphere or not. And this is where I focused on understanding what a content creator is, especially like I mentioned in the beginning, who is a professional content creator and how did they become someone, like how did they become this person who has some other occupation and is a content creator at the same time. That was very interesting to me. I had three subjects. Three of them were editors, and they were all men. But their work, according to me, by my reading, does not belong to the manosphere, not exclusively at least. So one thing that was very interesting to me in the edits that were being created, a little closer to the time that we are in now, is that edits on the internet created by young people would often use this cross-cultural references as the landing point. For instance, there would be a Hindi soundtrack, and there would be footage from another song by, say, Taylor Swift or a K-pop band, and both would be juxtaposed together. Yeah. So something like that is what I'll just take 5 minutes and wrap up in 5 minutes. So something like that is at the crux of how edits work. Here, what was interesting to me is how every person, every content creator defines virality, since they are aiming to make career out of it. And for everyone, the formula of what content becomes viral was very different. They all have their own reasons to believe that something might work and something may not. Some of them, it was very interesting in terms of understanding the idea of who is a technological have not. So one editor never had a laptop, not a laptop for the express purpose of creating edit, but he never had a laptop, and he self-taught Adobe Premiere, and he started making edits, and he didn't even know that people all across the state are consuming it. His friends told him about it. In another case, there was a person who did a VFX course like 15 years ago, and today he works freelance and with Netflix as well. So there are these very interesting success stories, and the trajectory is such that takes us back to the question, and I'll try to conclude the thing that I tried to pose initially. As to is the internet hosting humor as a site, is it actually affecting our study of the humor? Is it actually helping us define what a content creator is? And here I would like to put in a quote from one of the editors, which is very succinct, I think. He said that when you're a content creator, you're your own brand. You are your own producer, you are the actor, you're the talent, and you are the director. So you have to sell yourself, which is very interesting, because to me this means that people have the ability to do it. That being said, we cannot discount for the possibility that the world on the internet is also something that we have the hierarchies that are there in the offline world, in the real reality, so to say. Because the manosphere is sharing sexist humor, it is sharing homophobic humor, it is reinforcing caste hierarchies, it is marginalizing people who have embodied alternative masculinities. So there is the duality of both, in my opinion. And just to sum it up, I would say that the medium matters, but the medium is not the only thing that matters. So yeah, that would be it. I would be happy to answer any questions that come.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chitra. I'm really intrigued by this idea of manosphere. I have to read up on it, honestly. But I imagine that this kind of draws upon the idea of an ecosphere where a certain kind of a discourse holds the truth value for defined, the value assigning certain kinds of ideas as truth and other kinds of ideas as not as validated truths. And then the membership, which you pointed out, um, is not very restrictive, in the sense that women are part of that community. Would perhaps have to do with allegiance, with this kind of in ideology, or a kind of discourse that whether women or men can come to agree upon. If I can agree that the primary role of a man is breadwinning, then I can be part of the manosphere. And I would just want you to reflect upon this when we are discussing this further. But I'm deeply, deeply looking forward to hearing Professor Srila Roy. Professor Roy, are you able to hear me?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Lovely to meet you. Please, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much. So I do have a presentation, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Okay, let's see.
See it? Yes, and it's
Okay, can see it. Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me here. I caught a little bit of the last panel and it was absolutely fascinating. I'll just start by saying that I live on campus and we're getting close to graduation. There's a lot of Friday night revelry happening. So if you hear noise, I apologize in advance. So my talk today is called Skills Will Not Set You Free. And this is actually more a digital cultures talk than a social media talk. So I am here really examining skills training and labor formations in the information economy, especially as they relate to low-income women in Delhi. And there are some parallels here to the other talks that we've been talking about, especially when it comes to issues of labor, emotion, affect, resistance, pleasure, representation, etc. My larger project, which I engaged in for more than a decade, really studies the institutional and cultural politics of skills training initiatives in India. And in 2015, Prime Minister Narendra Modi introduces the Skills India initiative, and the promise of the Skills India initiative is really to very rapidly, bypass traditional educational systems and give vocational training and skills training to marginalized youth, especially in the context that India's youth population which is under 25, constitutes more than half of India's population. So my project is located in this. There are parts of this project that I won't go into today, but I just wanted to briefly mention it to give context. So for example, one of the things that I do is I historically trace the origins of industrial training institutes which exist, today, which offer skills training programs to the post-1857 colonial landscape in India, and draw parallels, between labor formations there and labor formations in the present day. So I also just wanted to briefly locate it in terms of a larger project. This talk is very much based through my ethnographic work in Silampur, which is in the northeastern part of Delhi. This is a relationship that I fostered with this community well over a decade. So I started doing this work before 2015, where these kind of skills training initiatives were becoming already popular through private-public partnerships, and then continued and got new impetus with the Skills India initiative. Silampur, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but to briefly locate it, has been described variously in the popular press as lumpen, as the capital city's underbelly. It has a long history of state-sponsored violence. So Emma Tarlow's book, for example, looks at how, and I will say at the outset that this is a diverse community, but mostly majority Muslim. And Emma Tarlow's book, for example, looks at how Silampur was really formed in the national emergency years in the 1970s, where Muslim men were essentially promised plots of land and agreeing to be sterilized, or as a motivator for sterilization practices. And this area has a long history of protests against the government. And, I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. So I really studied a computer training center, and why pick that center? Because post-liberalization in the Indian economy, but also really with the UN Millennium Goals, access to information and communication technologies becomes really elevated, as a more universal right. And India, for various reasons, including the growth of corporations and development and its own liberalization, becomes a very popular site of experiment for these kind of initiatives targeted at rapid economic and social transformations. So the Silampur Center was set up in collaboration with the Delhi government and private IT training, an IT firm that I'm calling GTech Foundation, and per my research protocol to protect anonymity. So this was set up, and this really emerged as a poster child for skills training initiatives directed at quote unquote minority women in the global South. So what was the promise? I'm trying to see my own slides. I'm sorry. The promise of the center, of these training programs was essentially leapfrogging, like the idea that if you would participate in these initiatives, you would transform, gain very rapid economic and social mobility. And this is to think about this sort of more critically, I'm thinking of feminist scholars, feminist development scholars like Tanya Murray Lee, or other critical scholars who have argued very much that development is, of course, not neutral. It's constituted as a power of unequal, as a field of unequal power practices, and that systems of trusteeship, for example, relationships between beneficiaries and producers of this project often work as common sense by directing deportment or habits towards like these commonsensical practices that often really serve to reinforce inequalities and create new ones, right? So the promise of the transformation, just to give a quick example from the Silampur Center, something that was often said was that if a particular occupation has been in the family for many generations, like being carpenters, learning computers is going to very rapidly push the family into a different world and into a different occupation. So this promise of inclusion in this new India. And also keep in mind that I started, this research actually as a graduate student in 2007, and then continued that for the next decade. So there's also all sorts of, things happening politically and culturally in India at this point. So just to get back to this, these programs really taught basic computer skills to Silampur women. And most of them, the women who came to the center, they had graduated 10th grade. And it taught them basic things like Microsoft Word, PageMaker, Dreamweaver, HTML, Photoshop. So these were the skills that were imparted to them, but also very importantly, it aimed to teach them soft skills training. That was part of the skills training. So it was about learning English to use customer service phrases, learning to speak English, but with the right accent. I did not see this very much in Silampur, but I would mention that in my other ethnographic sites, especially with corporate training programs in IIT, for example, there were actually textbooks that talked about hygiene, that taught hygiene to students as part of these computer skills training programs. So, for example, you must always shampoo your hair. If you have two pairs of, clothes, you should wash one every day. Don't wear too much hair oil. So, of course, these are embedded in very problematic histories of, caste, contamination, pollution, purity, etc. And as wonderful work, Carol Upadhyay's work, for example, has shown us that these kind of really soft skills training programs, despite their promise, do not transcend deeply entrenched institutional and familial inequalities and access. And then, of course, they were very bootstrapping, pull yourself up with the bootstrap kind of discourses. And you can see that on the right in the poster that the students had made. So very much, emphasizing individual discipline. You can conquer your circumstances only if you try enough, if you are disciplined enough. And the training discourses also very much, represented women in Silampur as veiled Muslim women. So that's a phrase that was often used. So this idea about bringing technology, again, quote unquote, into the ghetto, again, their phrase, not mine, to usher in rapid modernity, right? So, and we can also see some of this problematic representation here. So I spent a lot of time, in the computer center, both inside the computer center and in the doorsteps of the computer center, and looked at this promise, of this kind of leveling, of this rapid mobility and inclusion. So the women who came to learn computers were called computer ki ladki, the computer girls, and they were called this by the others. There were other classes in the center that used to happen, namely beauty culture and dress designing. And these women often sat on the floor to, to fulfill their task and learn these skills, whereas the computer girls obviously sat in chairs, they were at the computers. So in many ways, they were looked upon by the rest of the women in the center as, more stylish. There was what I call a more commodified femininity in the self-presentation. And this kind of division, they were cordoned off from the rest of the center by a makeshift screen. And, I've talked about in my earlier work how this kind of division really reflects what Raka Ray has called the politics of sitting, where, and she has talked about the relationship between domestic workers and employees in India, where domestic workers, for example, will sit in a stool, but, never at the same level as their employers. And of course, again, these are deeply entrenched in, histories of caste and, other and related discourses about pollution, contamination, etc. So my argument, here is that the women who did come to the center had a status in the center, but they're also really in the world outside the center in terms of complex, the heterogeneous middle class formations that they were among the better off families in Silampur. So their families usually own small businesses, for example, which also correlates to the fact that, Muslims in India often participate more in the informal economy because of structural barriers elsewhere. So this was among a better off group of women who came to the center. But at the same time, what I'm arguing is that this promise, despite relative privilege, this promise of mobility was very much restricted, in their lives outside the center. So first of all, the women themselves talked about the fact that, they were treated as women who had never stepped outside their outside their houses before they came to the center. And they challenged those notions and pointed out that they had employment. They had employments as nurses, as teachers, so there were very much that's representation, the publicity pictures of veiled women looking at computers and, as sort of positioned outside modernity and outside the modern workforce was not applicable to them. But when I followed women from these programs over years, one, of course, employment was not something that resulted often from these training classes. But again, this is no surprise. The kind of employment that did result was at the lower end of the information economy. So as a data entry person for the UID program, at that time, working at the ticketing counter in Metro, working in a mall, working at a lower end call center. But then despite the promise of air-conditioned workspaces, of wearing nice clothes, a lot of interviews that I did with women increasingly pointed out to the vulnerability of these positions, to getting paid really less, of being promised bonuses that never came, and essentially also of a lot of gendered violence in these sites of work. So this kind of sort of promise of rapid mobility and extension was something that was very much limited. And I think this is also ties back to sort of discussions about how development is conceived often as a depoliticized field, right? But and technology is really represented as a technical, like a magic solution to a lot of these inequalities, right? So then thinking more deeply about the reinforcement and the production of inequalities within these kind of development circles. So I don't know, I don't have a lot of time, but I'll wrap up in the next 5 minutes. Something that also ironically happened, and here we see questions of emotional labor, come up in interesting, complex ways, that the computer girls, because they came to the center and they spent a lot of time, the center was really also a place where residents could come and drop in forms for various social service schemes of the state. So for example, a scheme called Ladli, which was, meant to help the girl child, pension schemes, etc. And the computer girls, because of their sort of familiarity with technology, at least more than others, really sort of started representing, the state, ironically. And I can talk about that more in the Q&A. They became the caring face of the state, which was, of course, a very contradictory position, given that they were not given any compensation and recognition for this role, but also really had no power to negotiate or to do anything, concretely on behalf of the residents, right? But they shouldered this kind of caring face, this caring presence of the state, as they negotiated the training and their presence every day at the computer center. And I think related to that, many of them had structural critiques. Again, this is no surprise. I'm just highlighting one of them that really poked holes at this individualistic training discourse and pointed more to structural barriers and realities. So this is translated, but so Shehnaz, for example, said, if you do not have the basics of roti kapra makan, then how do you think of computers? And she was like, government ne kya hai? Just because you come and you open a GRC, if the government cannot go in and see whether a stove has been lit or a quarrel is brewing in the streets, how does it matter? I can work from day to night, but I feel that I'm learning computers without a plan here. And Shehnaz actually joined here because she wanted a medical imaging job. And she realized, after a lot of time spent in this program, that this was not going to be possible because she would actually have to have much more capital to invest in a program that would actually get her that. And I will end with one, and if some time permits, another example of thinking about sort of resistance and representation and play and critique. And I want to be careful here about resistance because I don't want to romanticize resistance, but I want to point at certain crucial moments in the training center where critiques emerged of these kind of training discourses. So one was an incident where, so the girls, the computer girls would play with Photoshop, and a very common activity, and this is not really representative of it, but a very common activity activity was to take a blonde woman and put her in this very idyllic surrounding, streams, mountains, etc. And there was this one time, there was a conversation, and one of them said, what happens if we put her in Selampur? And then people started laughing, and they said, oh, yahan nahi reh payegi, it's like she won't be able to survive here, dirty streets, crowded, like she won't last a day, right? And there was so much laughter that happened after that. And I think this kind of, play and representation really pointed to two things. One, I think there's the perceived, superiority in many ways that the computer girls knew they had in regards or in contrast to the way they were represented in policy and in program discourse, right, as submissive, women, but also very much to the structural barriers and the structural realities in which they lived that did not really, let them achieve the kind of mobility that was promised. And then I'll just end with this another example from there, which is that, when the class was held and this particular group I followed almost every day for a year, there was always these women, like, these three women, two generations, that would watch the class from opposite the street. And the computer girls would often, I really never saw any of them talk to them outside the training center, but they would sometimes laugh and, like be friendly. And they were always told by the staff to be quiet, like you're not being disciplined. What happens if you go into the world of work? You cannot work like that. But for example, there was a moment where one of the girls just took a USB stick and she was just like, USB stick deco, and these women just started laughing, right, opposite. And they were immediately be told to be silent. And the way this incident was read by the computer girls later was, it's not a big deal. I don't understand why, people should just let it go. Like the authorities should just let it go. And I think part of it is also that they understood knowledge production and learning more differently than the sort of capitalist, individualistic models of knowledge production and training that were being pushed on them. And I can again go into this more in Q&A, but I think in the context of Selampur, there is a very much like a counterfeit piracy culture that exists from, jeans to like ripped, media products and other things that facilitate technology and knowledge sharing. And I think there are these moments that ruptured holes and really sort of made us, prompted questions about the limitations of this kind of inclusion in the new India. So I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarkar. All right. Thank you so much, Srila. I'm going to invite questions from the attendees. And while we wait for some of the audience questions, I in fact got stuck at this idea of the Photoshop, the girls using Photoshop and trying to put this blonde girl and reflecting on the idea that if this blonde girl was in Selampur, she wouldn't survive a day. And that brings me to just quickly summarize the discussion that has happened here, which is deeply, deeply rich. When I was looking at your works and I was listening to your presentations, the things that I was thinking about was when obviously Rahul and Tripta's work pushes us to think about this idea of who can be photographed and what are the ways in which we would want to be photographed, and what goes into the idea of a picture when it is being staged for a very specific purpose of creating a narrative about the self, which is an affordance that only recently has come in the hands of, literally has come in the hands of a majority of people. And how does so Rahul's work obviously made me think about the art form that existed, wherein extremely rich emperors would commission paintings of themselves, which would show grandiose and valor as a way of gesturing to their audiences about their masculinity. So this is not particularly new. It's being adapted, and it's somehow become the way in which a larger majority would want to think of themselves. And I wonder, under what circumstances does that narrative become extremely attractive to then adapt and adopt for oneself? At the same time, I'm thinking about Tripta's presentation, and I'm thinking about how you can, across the works, what I could see was this element of invisibilized women who are looking at this photo, the woman in the Photoshop, and they feel alienated from this idea of what they're working on, or what the computer and the ICT represents, as opposed to their own structural experiences of living in Seelampur neighborhood. They're well aware of their possibilities of mobility using this particular ICT. And so it's the ideas of alienation and pride in certain ways become pride, politicization, and alienation are the ideas that I'm thinking about, and how do they reconcile, and how do they coexist on the same level. So pride for Rahul's work, alienation in what Srila was talking about, politicization in what Tripta is highlighting. So yes, I'm thinking about those, and I'm thinking about how the access to internet and an engagement with it is a deeply mediated endeavor by the identities that we experience closely. And the other element that I was thinking about was how disciplining of the body and the neutralization of the contextual signifiers, whether for computer girls who are learning these training things, which is at some distance, or is definitely distanced from their own experiences of life. It works to highlight the ambitions defined, and how the presentation of body being standardized in terms of the pronunciation, the hygiene aspect that Srila was talking about, but also in terms of the background that Rahul talks about, and the presentation of the body, the use of the vehicle, and all of that, allows for it to become the body to become more adaptable, the more open to reimagination, malleable, and possibly monetizable. So even with Tripta's work, I was thinking about how this particular picture of SRK being bound up is a certain way in which he's politicizing not just his presence, his own body, his experiences, but he's also taking ownership of it. So yes, at the same time, I'm thinking about subhumanization and risk and statement of the self that one owns. To a certain extent, computer girls own it in a different way. Men in Pune, young men in Pune are owning it a different way. SRK is owning it in a different way. And I would want the panelists to reflect on this statement of the self that the technology and the social media and media cultures is making possible for the Indian youth in contemporary times. I would be happy to have any reflections from the panelists on that. Anyone who would want to reflect on what these statements of self that the media cultures is making possible reflects on the youth and their lived experiences of contemporary times?
If no one is
Please. Sure.
Yeah. It's like, this is just such fascinating work, because it's just that is what I'm saying, that it doesn't seem like a dissociated panel, but a collaborative effort. So very well done, you guys. You took it really well planned. And I think that, yes, thinking through all the, you have encapsulated all the selves that, all the possibilities that are there in terms of thinking about these mediated presences. And I think that, I really do think that the young, they are very well aware of the alienation they are going through. They're very, like, there is an acute, understanding. And in my larger text, like, more so than ever. And, that we take what they are saying about themselves. And I'm talking about this across classes, but more so among the poor. So what they are saying about themselves, or what they are, to just like, like, make a leap of faith and think, like, allow ourselves to say ki sach bol rahe hain, allow them the liberties to make, fiction. Like, just let them. We also take liberties, right? We also take liberties with, like, frankly speaking, I'm putting it that way. But ethnographic research is all about taking those liberties and the ethical conundrums that come with it, right? So I'm saying कि एक बार ना मान के चलते हैं कि जो ये कह रहे हैं सच है. Like, let's just take and and start thinking about कि अगर ये झूठ है तो ये क्यों बोल रहे हैं झूठ? Or how are they arriving at this truth? Right? Either way, so let them. So I think, and because from my experience, I have had so much fun doing what I do, even though it's like, it's a very demanding thing to do, as anybody knows, all of us working in marginalized spaces. But बहुत मजा आता है. You really have a lot of fun, and you are like, with this whole, like, I'm a woman. And I'm like, I have a special relationship with SRK. But to be allowed entry into those words, and he was not the only one, that एक बार उनका झूठ सच मान के ही चलते हैं. But मतलब, at least let's just listen to एक बार, let's give them that benefit of doubt, even if, So yeah, that's so. Thanks for that. Really, thanks for this. The review, and I'm so thank you to all the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Yeah.
I can, just really quickly jump in on this question. Yeah, I really like, your comment about linking all of these things in the sense of the body becoming monetized, right? And is there like a reimagination happening? So this actually reminded me of, and I've written about this, this incident, these incidents that used to happen in the center, which is, I had a couple of young women who would always like run off in the middle of the class, and it was because they would be like they had to put on the rice for their mothers, right? And this would like get constantly challenged in that class, like, when you're working for a mall, you can't run off in the middle of your shift, right? But there was a lot of pushback from these women to sort of say that, this is not like, my life is sort of bigger than that, and it's more, complex than that. And I think one of the things about studying new media is that, we also forget that there are like other histories. So there are other histories of factory workers, for example, who create deliberately feminized spaces, right? Through baby showers or, other things to sort of fight back this kind of certain control and expectations of deportment and what the body and the ideal subject should look like. I also want, I wrote a recent piece about all this, and the reason it took me very long to write it, I will say, is that I am cautious about not romanticizing resistance, because when I talked to the computer girls, they were also very clear that these kind of programs are also one of the few opportunities, however imperfect, to make a living for their family. So ultimately, you do form part of that capitalist, structure, and there's an awareness that you give into it in some ways, but also to say, I think there are moments of of pushback, of resistance, of, pleasure and play that happen, that push back against this, creation of this kind of ideal monetized body.
Right. Rahul, do you want to come in? Chitra? Rahul? All right. With that, I think we're coming to a close. I would like to mention and thank my my deepest regard and thanks to Sriti. Dr. Sriti couldn't join us today. She's helped in putting together this amazing panel, and I thoroughly enjoyed each one of your talks and ideas and papers. I've read both Rahul and Srila's paper, and I thoroughly enjoyed those. So thank you so much, Polami and Sriti, for giving me this opportunity. And Sriti couldn't join us because of competing engagement. Thank you so much. I hope to stay with the questions that the panel has brought to us. I hope to mull over the things that I have heard and understood here to help me think through my own research. Thank you so much. Over to you, Polami.
Thank you, Smriti. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you so much for the panelist. I know it's your weekend, so it should be your and your family's time. So thank you for taking out time for us. I'm so sorry that we had to keep you up, Sheila. So I'm so glad you were able to join us. Hopefully it's not an but thank you so much. I do agree with Tripta. I think it just miraculously turned out to be a very cohesive, both the panels were very cohesive, and we had some really interesting discussions. These will be archived on our channel. So if you want to share these alongside, please do. And we look forward to collaborating with you further on developing some projects in these areas. That was the point of this curtain raiser, to showcase our interest and to ensure that the word gets out about what we want to do. But thank you for joining us, everybody. Also the attendees, although we have diminished now, you have my email. And thank you so much. And again, here we end. So see you next Saturday. Bye.
Thank